Yeah, I mean, early on in the war, the night area bombing was basically the only option. And cities were basically the only thing that they could hit, right? So that was the only effective way to use the air arm. Towards the end of the war, the reason Dresden got hit particularly hard, and it's a side issue that DPI didn't want to go into, but the Russians were advancing. All the refugees were coming back through Dresden. Dresden was a military movement center, but first of all, it was actually chocked with people. The second thing is because the Russians were coming, they'd stripped all the AA guns because they were the only effective thing at knocking out the tanks. So those were the two things that really played into Dresden getting hit so hard. The other thing is that whilst I would agree that bombing people doesn't have always the effect that you expect, and the Blitz is maybe the most obvious example of that, it is also true that you can bomb people into submission. Very early on in the war, the early Hamburg raid had a really tough blow on the German people because they weren't expecting this sort of military incursion so early. And Speer said later that 6 more raids like that would have ended the war. You know, this was essentially the sort of short, sharp shock that was like having one of your cities nuked. And,
yeah, Thunder.
I mean,
just so we're clear, I didn't not want you to go down that point. I just didn't think it was a moment in which to address the military significance of Dresden. But yeah.
Okay, let's. Hiroshima is a much clearer example. Yeah, was it okay to nuke Hiroshima, Michael?
Sorry, no, I don't think it was right to bomb Hiroshima.
On what basis, Michael? Because the common argument that is put forward is, yes, there was a huge loss of life, but ultimately it saved many more lives.
Because, again, the consequences of that did pass on much larger than what was initially calculated. You had radiation in that area that affected people for generations. Secondly, also, I'd say that it didn't work. It quite frankly, it didn't work.
Well, it did work.
They had to bomb another large city.
It was principal in bringing the end of the war, wasn't it? So in that way, it did work.
They needed to bomb Nagasaki afterwards as well. So,
okay, but the two events together worked. I mean, the two events together precipitated the end of the war in days and not in years. And I think
I'm
that
curious,
was the
Michael, because
goal.
normally you make such perfect sense, but I'm not getting you when you say that it didn't work.
Well, Hiroshima clearly didn't work because you needed another bombing.
Two together.
Yeah, okay, so putting the two together as well, under those circumstances as well, you're looking at a huge loss of life. A lot of that was civilian. It's debatable as well. We can get into exactly what was going on at that time, but there were other factors that were impacting this. Like the Japanese military were telling people, for instance, that they could shield themselves from nuclear radiation by wearing white, which were the emperor's colors, by the way. It's definitely true that, the impact of this was not completely rational. People didn't think that they would be killed by nuclear weapons. Many people didn't believe it at all. I think what had far more impact was the fall of Iwo Jima, the fall of the Okanagan Islands. At that point, also, the Japanese were completely stripped of resources as well. So it's very hard. It is a sort of selection bias that happens for people when they see that there's all of these different events, but they're selecting only these two to say that these were the ones that changed the tide of the war, when there were a lot of other ones, such as loss of supplies, loss of morale, that quite frankly also had a huge impact. So I don't think, again, that we can point definitively to these two bombings and say that that loss of innocent life and the innocent lives that were lost afterwards from the fallout were completely justified. I think it's very convenient that people do make those arguments, like that only when it becomes morally ambiguous that people make that type of categorical mistake.
So, from what I've heard, it was the key thing was there was actually a window in the attitude of the Japanese command, and basically, if the conventional bombing had been kept up, this was a sort of background noise that, another city's been wiped out by conventional bombing. These were the short, sharp, this was a game changer. And that was the game changer that allowed there was only a fairly short window in which Japanese would actually contemplate surrender. But arguably the largest effect of the nukes wasn't actually for the benefit of Japan, it was for Stalin. And it was to avert the World War III kicking off directly between the Russians and the Allies in Europe. It was a game changer that basically stopped war from kicking off in Europe. Because the other thing you've got to bear in mind is that Stalin was only days away from sort of voluntarily coming into the war with Japan. Which the Americans really didn't want. They needed to bring this to a resolution quickly. They also wanted to let Stalin know that they had this devastating new game-changing weapon.
Yeah, I think that's a more likely scenario, that they were actually bombing innocent people in order to frighten the Russians. But I don't think that justifies committing war crimes just to scare people into submission.
But, what's the difference between this and the firebombing of Tokyo, which killed of the order of 100,000 people, whilst the nukes killed 50,000 apiece or something?
I didn't argue that the Tokyo firebombings of civilians were ethical either. I think it's very, very clear to everyone in this conversation that we've sort of acknowledged that the United States and the Allies committed war crimes against innocent people. And I'm not getting why that people can sit quite comfortably and say this and believe that it was the right thing to do.
Okay, now let's put you in the commander chair. What is the correct thing to do? Right, you are sat off. You've invaded Okinawa. You are sat off the Japanese home island. Mm-hmm. What is the correct thing to do at this point?
It's. Sorry.
And why?
I have to laugh
why
a little.
Is correct?
It's not as if this hasn't been discussed. I mean, there had been over 100 years of discussions on ethical, on what war crimes were, like the Hague Convention and Geneva Convention. You attack only uniformed military targets. You attack only military and industrial structures. You try to minimize as far as possible innocent civilian life being lost. If people surrender to you, then you have to care for them and treat them as prisoners of war. Like, these were things that the Allies just refused to do because, and to my mind, this isn't ethically justifiable. They had known it was wrong. They had signed onto these declarations of what the war crimes were. They knew full well what they were doing. I don't see, and we had known what the rules of war had been, and they expected, I think it's also fundamentally hypocritical as well.
So,
for us to say, when Japanese or German generals were being hanged for exactly the same crimes that American and Allied generals had committed themselves.
I wouldn't go for the generals. You're probably right, but would it have been ethical to have just blockaded the island and let it starve to death?
Again, you tried to minimize as much as possible the loss of innocent life by attacking military targets.
I'm going to insist that we move on to our next caller who's been waiting patiently.